Good evening, and welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is key issues facing the nation, and our host is Mike Mulhall.
Welcome. The American Families Association presents tonight Key Issues Facing the Nation. Our guests are Herb London, who is president of the Hudson Institute, a world-renowned think tank in Washington, D.C., and professor emeritus at NYU. Dr. London is a noted social critic whose work has appeared in every major newspaper and journal in the country, including the Wall Street Journal, among other papers. He's also been a guest lecturer on many radio and TV news programs and has appeared as co-host on the popular CNN program Crossfire. In 1990, he was the Conservative Party candidate for governor of New York, obtaining more votes than any third-party candidate in New York history. In 1994, Herb London was the Republican Party candidate for New York State Comptroller, losing a close election. Dr. London is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. With us tonight also is Frank Russo, who is president of the American Family Association of New York and serves on the board of directors of Morality and Media, the advisory board of the United New York for Choice in Education, and the executive committee of the Nassau Conservative Party. Frank has appeared on Phil Donahue, Geraldo, Larry King Live, and dozens of other radio and TV talk shows. Tonight we're going to discuss some of the major issues facing our nation. My co-host tonight is Connell Friel. Connell?
Thank you, Mike. Tonight we're discussing some of the major issues facing our nation and in the near future. These include the topics of national security, the economy, which is facing a serious credit crisis, and the current problems facing American families. Let's get into each of these areas. Dr. London, how do you view the current status of the nation's security, and what can Americans do to protect themselves from terrorist acts?
Well, there are three areas that I think we have to concern ourselves with. One, we have to defeat the enemy on the battlefield. I'm absolutely convinced that we can win the war in Iraq, that the surge has been quite successful, that General Petraeus is the right general. Just as Lincoln had to search for General Grant and went through a number of generals, our president has gone through a number of generals before he has found the right one, and he has the right one now. So I'm convinced that we can defeat the enemy on the battlefield. Second, I think we've got to recognize the fact that the only way in which we can deal with the fanaticism of Islam, which is the enemy that we are now facing, is to recognize the traditions that give this nation strength. So I'd like to see the reassertion of American traditions instead of the flaccid relativist response that we have at the moment to the threat that we are facing on the world stage. And then three, I think we have to recognize that we are already at war with a nation that has not been declared as an enemy, and that is Iran. Iran is fighting us through its surrogates in Hezbollah, through Hamas, and of course through Syria as well. So we have to recognize what the threat is. We cannot permit Iran to possess nuclear weapons because it'll become the hegemon in the Middle East. Even the Sunnis will make their deal with the Shia in Persia or in Iran. So we've got to do everything in our power to try and control the Iranian imperial impulse, which clearly exists at the moment. Those are the three dimensions of the problem. Toynbee once made the point, and it's a very interesting point, that societies, civilizations do not die as a result of murder. They die as a result of suicide. So we have to face the internal weaknesses and loss of confidence in the United States. When I talk about the reassertion of traditions, I'm talking about recognizing what are the idiosyncratic and unique features that make this country so successful. And that is what we have to try and remember.
What action would you recommend against Iran?
Well, against Iran?
Yeah.
Well, again, I think you have to take every measure you can to prevent Iran from possessing nuclear weapons, as I've suggested. The sanctions are not going to work, in my judgment, largely because the Security Council, with the veto that's possessed by China and Russia, will not permit sanctions with real teeth. Second, I think you've got to do everything that you can to control the refineries that are presently sending oil back into Iran. Iran, of course, is producing a lot of oil, second largest producer of oil in the world at the moment. But the problem is they don't have refineries. Well, we've got to control those refineries or refined oil that is going back into Iran. And then third, I think that the military option at some point may have to be exercised. And that might have to be done in concert with Israel. It might have to be done uniquely by the United States. It's complicated because there are at least 3 or 4 centers that would have to be attacked. You'd also have to use bunker busters, which are bombs that go very deep into the ground. They're heavy bombs, so you'd probably need an air arsenal of something on the order of 200 planes. It's a complicated mission, very, very difficult to organize. But at some point, this country is going to have to come to the realization that we cannot permit Ahmadinejad to be controlling the political agenda in the Middle East.
Thank you. Frank, same question.
Yeah, and I'm going to focus more on the local issues, the local aspects
You're not
of
for
it.
bombing Iran right away. Okay.
Well, and I respect Herb's view on all that, but I'm not as knowledgeable on those foreign aspects. But domestically, and these are controversial areas. Herb may not even agree with me. One is the wiretapping issue that is being debated in Congress. We have a delicate balance between the right to privacy and the right to be protected against these fanatical terrorists. And everything that I understand about the wiretapping legislation that's been proposed by the Bush administration to enable our FBI and CIA agents and other foreign intelligence agents to gather information involving sources that would fall into a general category that would make them more suspect for this kind of activity. Too many, I think, and they're generally the liberal Democrats, are stressing this right of privacy to such a degree that they will make it almost impossible to gather this kind of wiretapping information in the time frames, which are very abbreviated, to save American lives should this happen again. So while we want to protect privacy, on the other hand, I'm more concerned right now about these acts of terrorism, and I would trust our government to gather this information by wiretapping much more than these liberal Democrats. A second aspect, and very controversial, is identification of people. There are a lot of people on the conservative side and the liberal side who tend to oppose the national ID card. I, for one, favor it. I've thought about this long. I think something like a national ID, comparable to a driver's license, only would be national to enable, and I think that would facilitate some of the slowdowns we see at airports and whatnot. We need a national ID card that would enable people at the airports in 10 seconds to, via computers, check who this person is and know if this person is someone that we have to, search in a very lengthy way or not. So I'm for a national ID. And the final area, very delicate, very controversial, immigration. And I like to balance that also. On the one hand, the country has a right to control its borders. We've got to stop illegal immigration. And the way I favor focusing on that is going after employers who are doing this, the hiring of illegal aliens. But second, on the other side, balancing on the other side, I think we've got to be a little more generous in our immigration policy. I think we've got to increase the number of immigrants that we allow to come into this country legally. I think there's a kind of visa called something like H-1B or HB-1. I forget what it's for, these people with technical skills. We've got to up that. I think it stands at 65,000 a year now. I'd up that at least to 100,000, if not more, to allow more people who can contribute to our country to come in, so long as they are not have no criminal records that would preclude that. So those are three areas that I'd want to focus on.
I was just going to highlight for 1 second the first issue you brought up about FISA. There's an important distinction just for our viewers to know that just to put this in context, the idea behind FISA law right now and why it needs to be updated is because of the marvelous amount of innovations in technology that are now embedded in our society, and the FISA law has not kept up consistent with that. And so that's the reason why it needs to be revisited. And I think, based on what I've read, that the FISA law that they're looking to amend really is appealing to the fact that we have people overseas using American technologies, and it's the ability to look into data that is overseas. It still doesn't allow for Americans to be surveilled. It's overseas. Yes. So I'm sorry.
Okay,
your point.
No problem. Dr. London, let's discuss the economy. With the credit and mortgage crisis, coupled with a falling dollar, mounting trade deficits, rising unemployment, and problems with Social Security and Medicare, how do you view the nation's economic future?
Well, look, I remain sanguine about America. I'm always sanguine about America. I like to believe that the best is still simply in our future. And so I take a somewhat different view. There's no question that there are structural problems that we are now facing. The unfunded liability in the United States, simply based on Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, is on the order of 6 or 7 times GDP. So to work our way out of that problem is going to be a long and very painful process. Second, I think that the credit crunch that we are now facing is also a deep-seated process. And as Mike knows probably better than I, there are real issues on Wall Street, and the credit balance may be at zero. A lot of the leveraging, a lot of the political problems that have been imposed on Wall Street account for the problem. Third, I think it's very important to note that we are going to go through a cycle of inflation. The price of oil clearly accounts for that. While the Fed has eased, how much more can they ease? Another percentage perhaps? The fact is that they're going to have to reverse that at some point. They're attempting to deal with the credit crisis now, but the real issue that we are going to be facing in the future is perhaps double-digit inflation. And so the Fed is going to reverse its condition and start increasing interest rates. So I think that there are structural problems, but keep in mind that there are some positives on the horizon as well. I mean, Bill Clinton would have been thrilled to run with an unemployment rate of 5.1%. Keep in mind that it has gone up slightly from 4.5 to 5.1% over the last 6 months. And we're going to see it go up even higher. Wall Street is likely to lose something on the order of 40,000 jobs before December. And that is worrisome. But again, in the aggregate, a 5.1% unemployment rate would have been something the Clinton administration would have been happy to run on. Second, I think that you also see that there's still extraordinary innovations based into our system, despite the fact the private equity firms are a little nervous at the moment. There are great innovations just over the horizon. This country is still the place, because of our liberties, that produces the most interesting, skilled entrepreneurs in the world. So I remain sanguine, although in the short term, I think there are unquestionably great problems that are going to have to be addressed.
Frank, same question, the economic future of the country.
Well, and the Fed clearly, I think, erred in leaving the rate at 1% for such a long period of time, for several years like that. I think that
What rate is that?
the rate that the
Fed
banks
funds
borrow,
rate.
the Fed
The
funds
Fed
rate
funds
that
rate.
the banks can borrow overnight funds on, and that all contributed to, in part, many other factors as well, to the rise in property values that were not warranted by solid economic factors. You had a lot of speculators investing in properties. You had a lot of financial institutions, and again, I don't fully understand how they got away with this, but I saw it happening. People would come up with 100%, even more than 100%. If the price of a home was $400,000, they'd get a loan for $420,000 to cover the closing costs and everything else. It was absurd, without checking the credit ratings of the people who were taking these loans. So the lenders made lots of mistakes, and then they securitized these loans, they collateralized them, they bundled them together in a process that was reviewed by somebody, I don't know who, and who gave these ratings, AAA ratings rather, when they were not warranted. So there's a lot of people who made mistakes, maybe even did fraudulent things that should not be now bailed out by the taxpayer. They say the government, they really mean bailed out by the taxpayers. Taxpayers are assuming tens of billions of dollars in risk now for speculators and for these financial institutions that did not properly evaluate who they were loaning money to. So that's another major problem, and it's not near resolution yet. And finally, on Social Security and Medicare, Social Security, we used to have 10 people working for every person receiving Social Security. It's now down to 3 to 1, and that means if a person is paying, say, $6,000 a year in Social Security tax, which is on the high side, that's the most you could pay. A lot of people are paying $3,000 and $4,000. That means a person's you would only expect to see $9,000 to $12,000, maybe $15,000 in payments to Social Security recipients. They're getting much more. So the Social Security system is on the road to bankruptcy. Everyone knows that. We've got to discuss what steps to take. Privatization is one, very controversial, but another one, nobody wants to talk about it, would be perhaps to reduce the cost of living adjustments every year, maybe by just 1%. So if cost of living is 4%, you give Social Security, and I got my first Social Security check just last week for the first time in my life, but I'd reduce it maybe by 0.5% or 1%.
We'll just pause right here because we're at the halfway mark in our show. And please stay tuned for this public service announcement, and we'll be right back.
When's Daddy coming home? Soon.
Other news, negotiations broke down again.
Daddy! Jared, wait!
You got me.
So how was work?
Brutal. One meeting after another. I got a ton to do tonight.
At the end of the day, when the weight of the world is upon you,
Daddy doesn't want to play. Hey,
isn't it amazing
all right.
how the weight of their love can lift you up again?
Hey, you guys coming to dinner? Hey,
brochure about rediscovering the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY. Focus on the family.
Welcome back. Our guests tonight are Herb London and Frank Russo, and we're going to pick up, Frank, you were
Just to
making some
finish up
points
quickly,
on Social Security.
We've got to do something. I mean, I don't want to reduce my Social Security check or anyone else's, but we can't let it go on with the current formula. It's going to go bankrupt very, very quickly, quickly being 10, 20 years, something in that order. I think we've got to possibly reduce, one suggestion, reduce the cost of living adjustment by 0.5% or 1%. Always, cost of living goes up 3%, you give them a 2.5 or 2% increase rather than the full. That would be a big step towards addressing this problem. We've got to do something. We can't keep raising the Social Security tax. Our kids and our grandkids are just not going to be able to afford it. And in Medicare, certain hospital procedures, medical procedures are trying to guard against lawsuits. We've got to start considering the balance between protecting people and giving them their rights to sue malpractice, but on the other hand, I think that's being carried to such an extent that it's driving up medical costs and driving up medical procedures where they go to the nth degree to take steps to avoid a problem when it's cost prohibitive and the system's going to break down.
Fair. Herb, I'm going to rechange the topics a little bit away from the national issues, so much in terms of finance and defense.
Can I make a comment about some of the
Please
things
do.
that Frank, I mean, look, I'm in substantial agreement with many of the points that Frank has made. One minor point about dealing with Social Security, particularly with Medicare, the Medicare obligation. If the United States were to give serious consideration to medical savings accounts starting with your first job that are cumulative, at the moment it's either use it or lose it. But if you had accumulated medical savings accounts, which, by the way, would obviously compound over the lifetime of an individual, and in your 20s, you're not going to have great need for medical usage. But by the time you're 60, you will. It seems to me that you will have a pile of money available if you were to consider doing that. And I think the government is going to have to start thinking innovatively about matters of that kind. I'm sorry.
Fantastic idea. I applaud that. That's another very good idea, I think.
Excellent suggestion. But I want to bring the question back in terms of how is the American family doing today, in your opinion, based on, say, in comparison with 25 and 50 years ago, on items such as children's educational development, health care, housing, and the tax burden that's facing our families today?
Well, I think that there are several factors that have to be taken into account. One, I would say, one of the real problems that you have in the family structure is what I would describe as cultural degradation. There used to be a point in American history where elites represented models that you wanted to emulate. Now, if you talk about the elites in society, these are elites who are creating a real problem for the average person because they set a standard that makes no sense. Children out of wedlock, problems associated with drug use, these are issues that I think have to be taken into account. In addition, you used to have, at least de Tocqueville talked about, mediating structures in American society, namely the church, the schools, the family. All of them are in disarray. The church, by and large, has become a social institution, not a religious institution. The schools, by and large, no longer teach. They engage in either preaching or engage in activities that have nothing to do with education. And we find ourselves in a peculiar situation with the family where the divorce rates are very high and where family breakups occur, so that the mediating structures which normally create stability in a society are not available. So I think that when I talked initially about the reassertion of tradition in America, these are the very traditions that I'm getting at. The Bush administration did understand one thing, and that is that you have to do whatever you can to promote the idea of religious institutions in society because they have a very positive social effect on the way in which people engage in behavior and in their relationship to the larger society. Once those institutions are in disarray, you find yourself in real problems. To give you just one statistic, for example, and this number has been stable, so it's not exactly a bad trend, but if you were to talk to just the black families in America, 70% of the children born into black families in the United States today are born out of wedlock. And then look at one other statistic, and that is people in our prisons. 85% of the 1.5 million people who are in American prisons today do not have fathers. Well, is it any wonder that they engage in criminal behavior? You need a man in the home who is capable of producing some sort of order. Moms are wonderful, and they can produce love and affection, but fathers invariably produce order. If you don't have that order in the home, you've got a real problem. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we even have poverty in America. The only justification for poverty in America is children out of wedlock. There's a direct correlation between female-headed families and poverty. You can eliminate that problem, you virtually eliminate poverty in the United States.
Frank, same questions to you.
Everything Herb said is right on target. It's absolutely correct, and he brings with it a lot of background and study on this. The divorce rates, depending on how you calculate divorce rates, some people count them as, and this is the typical way they say, the divorces per year divided by the marriages per year, that's 50%. If you just look at first marriages that wind up divorce, it's 40%. So 40% of all marriages will eventually divorce if they're first marriages. We used to be half that some 70 years ago, but it's now leveled off. At least it's not getting any worse. But what is happening is young people are deferring marriage. They're getting married at later and later ages, but they're not avoiding sex. They're having sex before marriage, often having children. These children, as Herb said, we have now 37.5%, 3 out of every 8 children born in the United States last year in 2007, no father at home. As he said, in the African-American population, it's 70%, 7 out of 10. Hispanic, it's 50. The white population, it's at 25%. We used to be 4% back in 1950, 1960. The white population's rate of having children out of wedlock, no father at home, has gone up from 4% to 25%, mind-boggling. And the correlation with poverty, crime, drug use, and educational problems. And that final area I wanted to talk about was education. Educational quality in the United States is not what Americans like to think it is. It's not that good. If we compare ourselves to Western Europe, we are at the bottom of the heap. Our colleges do a fine job. Our colleges come out very, very well. But kindergarten through 12th grade, no. And one of the reasons is that's the last unnatural monopoly and the largest unnatural monopoly remaining in the United States. I wrote a letter to my local paper recently, and some education professor with 30 years experience wrote back, and Mr. Russo, what is it? I've been teaching about education for 30 years. I never heard it described as an unnatural monopoly. What is unnatural about it? That's his question. An unnatural monopoly, I mean, the man is obviously not in economics. Natural monopoly is delivery of water, where it's obviously the only way you're going to do it in an efficient way. But education does not have the characteristics warranting it to be a government, and of all kinds of monopolies, the worst kind are government-run monopolies. What we could do that would stimulate the quality of education most and reduce the cost, because taxpayers across the country are increasingly facing a tremendous cost for education, is to introduce competition. Give parents choice. That empowers the parent. If a parent wants to have certain moral values inculcated, certain religious values, that should be up to the parent, and they should not be precluded from doing it. Unfortunately, in too many parts of our country, there are what's known as Blaine amendments, and it's stopping the right of parents to choose schools to be granted to them. And that is hurting the quality of education and driving up costs astronomically, unfairly burdening taxpayers without improving the education given children.
Frank, can I just make one point? I mean, I agree with 99% of what Frank says. 1% I disagree with, and the 1% is when he said, we're doing a pretty good job in their institutions of higher learning. I don't believe that for a moment. Goldstein Veblen once made the point that if you look at American universities, and this goes back to the turn of the century, the 20th century, he said, we are training our students in incapacity. And that was then. It's much worse now. The situation has been magnified. Institutions of higher learning have become political institutions, and orthodoxy has emerged on campus. Students are not getting a first-rate education. We pay an enormous fee for training people in incapacity. I've been involved in university life for 35 years. I can assure you that the quality of education in the United States and our institutions of higher learning outside of the sciences, is really appalling. And if you look at literature programs today, they've become exercises in political acculturation. They have nothing at all to do with literature. I instituted a great books program when I was at New York University, and it had Shakespeare, and it had Plato, and it had Aristotle, and it had Aeschylus, and you can guess the rest. Now it has Shulamith Firestone, and it has Frantz Fanon, and it has Toni Morrison. It is no longer the same kind of program. Why? Because of political correctness and the enormous pressures that are now put on universities in order to maintain a certain kind of politically correct standard. So, Frank, I agree with you 99% of the time, 1%. That one comment.
And I just wanted to add one very quickly on that, the political correctness at universities. I've just become aware of instances, and I've been told this by professors, and again, it's not in the physical sciences, it's in the social sciences, sociology, psychology, these areas where professors are being denied tenure because they happen to be not liberal enough, because they happen to be, oh my goodness, a little bit conservative, and they're denied tenure at prestigious universities across our country. I'm hoping some lawsuits are going to be brought by those professors so denied tenure inappropriately.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes before the end of our show, but I want to get both your thoughts on the impact of abortion and gay marriage, a minute each from both of you, in terms of how they're impacting our society as well.
Well, let me give you my view. It's a kind of Nietzschean view of this. I feel that these are both conditions that reflect a certain kind of societal nihilism. These are death impulses in the society. Marriage was defined as a man and a woman engaging in marriage for the obvious reason of procreation. Did not include people who of the same sex. And in the case of abortion, the idea that somehow you would take an innocent life and destroy it just not only does not make sense to me, but when you consider what are the economic and social implications of that kind of act, it seems to me that the society is engaged in a form of nihilistic behavior. So I return to Nietzsche, who of course embraced this kind of nihilism in a way and said that we're going to obviate all of the standards that existed in the past and create an existential standard. But you pay a price for these existential standards. If a red light doesn't mean you stop anymore, you pay a price for it. And we are paying a very, very significant price in my judgment.
Frank?
And yeah, very quickly on abortion, theologians for eons have disagreed on when human life begins, when ensoulment takes place. Philosophers have disagreed. Lawyers 200 years ago argued that black people were not persons. But science today is, there's no controversy. A new human life begins at the moment of conception. We are destroying human life, there's no question about it. And the quantity of human lives being destroyed is unknown to most people. Every night on the news, I'm reading about the fact that we have 4,000 Americans who tragically and terribly lost their lives in Iraq over 5 years. 4,000 people lost their lives of our wonderful soldiers. Every day, that's how many babies are being killed by their own mothers in abortion with the approval and often urging of the fathers of these children. Abortion is a crime against humanity. It really hurts the reputation and image of the United States, I think, certainly in God's eyes, if not in our eyes.
Well, I want to thank you both. I want to thank my co-host, Colin Friel, for tonight's illuminating show. This was a very productive session, and I thank you both. You've been watching the American Family Association Presents. Tonight, we're looking at key issues that face our nation. We want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the same time next week. Thank you. Good night.